Honourable Leader of the Official Opposition.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, my first question is to the Premier. Premier, why is your government outsourcing development of the regulations for the Lobbyist Registration Act?
The Honourable Minister of Justice and Public Safety.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. And Mr. Speaker, I'm not sure where the Honourable Member got that information from, but we're not, Mr. Speaker. Thank you.
Thank you, Minister. The Honourable Leader of the Official Opposition.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, again to the Premier. Government is now advertising an advance contract award notice for implementing a new lobbyist registry. It's like a tender, but a supplier is already picked and you're checking to see if anyone else meets the job requirements. Again to the Premier, why would you go this way instead of simply having a public tender?
The Honourable Minister of Justice and Public Safety.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. And Mr. Speaker, so to be very clear about what's going on here, it's in relation to the actual database that would be put in place, Mr. Speaker. And as we've debated here in the House, we have a new corporate registry that's will hopefully have activated, I guess, by the early fall of this year. And the company that is referenced in the document that the Honourable Member is speaking about is Davis Peer. That's the same company. Due to the time constraints, Mr. Speaker, and their knowledge of the back-end systems that would be required to implement this database, Mr. Speaker, the thought was that they have already met many of the requirements, and so this is a process that was recommended by Treasury to move this process along. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Thank you, Minister. Honourable Leader of the Official Opposition.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. Again to the Premier. Another contract requirement was for providing drafting assistance for regulations. So why would you need to hire consultants to write government regulations instead of using government lawyers?
The Honourable Minister of Justice and Public Safety.
Mr. Speaker, to be clear, again, this particular piece is in relation to the software implementation that dovetails with the regulations, Mr. Speaker, and there is a piece where there has to be compliance between the two for obvious reasons. So regardless of who has the pen, Mr. Speaker, the software developer that is preparing the database obviously would have to be integrally involved in the preparation of those regulations. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Thank you, Minister. The Honourable Leader, Official Opposition.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. So in the information that's available online, another contract requirement is for stakeholder engagement and communications. So again to the Premier, why would you need to contract those functions out when you already have a whole division for communications and public engagements in Executive Office?
The Honourable Minister, Justice and Public Safety.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. And Mr. Speaker, again, there's a requirement that the software that is required to support or operate this database be prepared, Mr. Speaker. And this is the same process that we undertook with the Business Corporations database, Mr. Speaker. And Davis Peer was involved extensively with that process, Mr. Speaker. They're a very professional outfit that were involved in a tender process for that, Mr. Speaker. And I'll be very clear to say, Mr. Speaker, that this process is not designating Davis Peer as the successful applicant, Mr. Speaker. It's indicating that they have indicated a willingness to do it at a certain price and to canvass the possibility that there might be others in that very confined space, Mr. Speaker. Thank you.
Thank you, Minister. The Honourable Leader of the Official Opposition.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. Question again to the Premier. The contract note says that the work would start on July 1st, take at least 9 months, and cost at least $85,000. The Lobbyist Registration Act received royal assent almost 6 months ago and yet has to be proclaimed. Question to the Premier. What is the reason for the delay in having the Lobbyist Registry up and running?
The The Honourable Minister, Justice and Public Safety.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. And so, Mr. Speaker, what's been going on since the Lobbyist Registration Act passed through this Assembly is exactly as the Honourable Member had indicated, and is the preparation of draft regulations, Mr. Speaker. And so what then happens, Mr. Speaker, is that the successful applicant will take those draft regulations, determine what can be done with software to activate them, Mr. Speaker. And once we get that entire package together, the Act will be turned on, if you will, Mr. Speaker. It will be proclaimed and will be put in place. And Mr. Speaker, this is exactly a part of the reason why Davis Pier has been named in this particular way, because they're there. We know that they've worked well through the corporations database. We know that they're available and can do this work, Mr. Speaker, in a timely fashion. Thank you.
Thank you, Minister.